we ended up getting into this random cab and we're driving sort of toward these front lines, and you just see all these people that were fleeing from outside the city and coming in, and there really wasn't any, and the cab driver just turned around and looked at me and he said, "I'm scared." And then by that evening, Jake and I had gone out to this kebab cafe that we always go to, and we just looked at each other and there was nobody in the street. There was just nobody there. And this cafe normally is quite vibrant. The TVs are on playing soap operas. The TV was off and there was just, it was so bizarre. And we just looked at each other and said, we need to go.
Yeah.
So we started to hurry back toward our hotel, and as we're hurrying back, I remember turning around and just seeing these motorcycles coming into the city, and that was the Taliban, and that was how quickly they were able to take it over.
Joining me today is Hollie McKay. Hollie McKay is a twice published author, well, soon to be twice published author. Yeah, the second book is in the works.
In the works.
Yeah. Okay. Also an investigative journalist, originally from Australia, formerly a Fox News contributor. Thanks for joining me today, Hollie. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
You bet. So I've talked to quite a few of my friends and followers, and they're all fairly familiar with who you are. But I know that some of my followers won't be as familiar. But so I know you're from Australia, born in Australia. So after that point, kind of give us a little bit of your background as far as how you ended up where you are now.
Sure. So I was born and raised in Australia in a small country town, and I went to boarding school. I was a ballet dancer growing up, and that's sort of the career that I thought that I would go into. And then I broke my ankle when I was 18. And so I went back to university. I got a little bit restless and decided that I was going to finish my degree in New York. So I came to New York, and that was in 2006. I was 20 and sort of randomly got this internship at Fox. And then they, at the end of that, they offered to sponsor me. They had a job for me in LA. So I went to Los Angeles and lived there a while and was doing a lot of different things in general assignment, etc. And then I guess in my mid-20s, that's when I really started to focus on being a war reporter, which is what I really wanted to do. And yeah, from there, so it's been, more than a decade now of traveling to different countries and kind of being in the thick of it, I guess.
That's really cool. So you're always looking for a new adventure, yeah?
Yeah, I am. It's terrible. I've been back a week from, a long assignment in Afghanistan, and I'm already plotting where I'm going to go next and trying to make excuses to run away. So it's kind of the life of the war reporter. It's hard coming back.
Huh. Well, so you went from ballet dancer to journalist.
Yes.
So in between that period of time, I mean, how did you make that leap, right? I mean, how did you go? Were you always interested in journalism? And I guess I'm assuming you have like maybe some sort of education in communication and things like that.
Yeah, I think for me, I was more interested in writing. Growing up, I was always writing. Mm-hmm. From a very young age, just always writing. And that was something I really loved. But I never saw that as a career option, or never understood how you would become a writer and make a living. It just seemed sort of something that you did because you loved it. So really, when I went to university, I was studying sort of communications, but a lot of human rights law. I considered kind of going down that path. But yeah, this sort of journalism really fell into my lap. And that was when I was in New York, and everybody was talking about these internships. And that wasn't something we really had in Australia. I was working full time and going to night school. Mm-hmm. That was just how it was. But this was sort of a new concept. And I wanted, well, what is this? I want to do this too, kind of thing. And yeah, and that's sort of and I think because I had a background in web coding a little bit and also in writing, they put me in the digital, which 2006, it was very much the beginning of that digital era. It hadn't really taken off. The focuses were still on television. And the digital was sort of considered a subsidiary. And I think the other interns all wanted to be on air and they all wanted to go. And, whereas I still now, that's the least of my interest. Yeah. So it worked out better for me because I was sort of the only intern there and was able to really, I think, work very hard. And mind you, this was a time before there was so many stringent labor laws. I think interns now are very much subjected to you're only allowed to work certain hours, you're only allowed to do certain things. And I think interns actually have to be paid. Yeah. Whereas when I was doing it, I wasn't paid. I went in on days that I didn't have to go in. I stayed for a lot longer hours than I needed to. And I think having that ability to do that worked to my advantage because, when you have that work ethic, and that really paid off because I was offered, not only a job, but a sponsorship, which at that age, that's very hard to come by. And so I knew that opportunity, as much as a part of me really still wanted to go back to my dancing career. I think a part of me knew that it was such a unique chance to live in America and to really do something that was exciting. And so I kind of jumped at it. Nice.
I remember when we were at the Christmas party at D'Angelo Publications, and you were talking about how you were given elocution lessons as a young kid from, was it a British nun? Is that?
Yes. Yeah. So my mom thought, growing up in a small town, I think, she thought she'd, get us into these classes and have two, have an older sister. So she would have two, nice young ladies. And maybe it worked out for my older sister.
Refined and proper. Is that what she wanted?
I think so. I think she would just, I think for her, she never had those opportunities growing up. And so she just, thought she'd put my sister and I in ballet lessons and elocution lessons and piano lessons and all sorts of things. But yeah.
Do you feel like that's paid off a little bit? I mean,
I think it has. I think at the time I really always hated going to those things. Definitely the piano didn't work out for me. I was more interested in looking at the inside of the piano and watching these keys go up and down than I was to actually learn anything. But yeah, I think that the elocution lessons, they did. At the time, I really hated them. But I think it gave me it just sort of gave me a little bit of poise and a little bit of refinement that I maybe wouldn't have had otherwise. So,
well, I feel like there's a lot of people that could probably benefit from lessons like that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
So I think if I have a daughter, I think it's kind of a nice quality that it's a little bit old fashioned, but I think it's still something nice to have. It's still, manners never hurt.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. And it never hurt to be able to speak, clearly and enunciate your words and, have somewhat of a more extended vocabulary than what we're getting on social media these days.
Yeah. And also got exposed to some really lovely literature and poetry and some of the real classics that, I otherwise wouldn't have known. So it's still I think it opens your eyes to different things and certainly gives you just a different perspective at a very young age.
Cool. So I like to get this out of the way early on while people are still fresh and engaged, but where can people find you if they want to follow you on social media or find your book?
Yep. So you can go to, I'm on Twitter and Instagram. Don't use Twitter much, but Instagram I do. It's Hollie, HOLLIE. SMCKAY is my handle for both of those. You can get links also from my website, which is holliemckay.com. And I also have a Substack, which I try to keep updated on my travels and some of the policies and the, investigative things that I'm working on. And that is just holliesmckay.substack.com.
Cool. Yeah, go follow Hollie McKay. She's got a lot of interesting stories and experiences for sure. So let's talk about Afghanistan. You just got back from there. And I mean, you were in the thick of it. I mean, as far as I know. So now, we know what we know based on what we see, in the news, people here in the States, but you were there, eyes on, right in the middle of all of it. Can you kind of paint the picture for everybody as to what you saw and experienced?
Sure. So I went to Afghanistan with a friend of mine who's a photographer also from Australia. And we went right at the beginning of August. Our plan really, we'd been planning it for a couple of months, was to document the US withdrawal and really look at how the Afghan government was going to stand on its own. At least that's what we thought we would be doing. But pretty much, we'd been there, I think, about a week and we'd gone to the north to a city called Mazar Sharif, and it was always a very strong anti-Taliban resistance city. And in fact, after September 11, that was where the first US troops entered the country to take out the Taliban from power. Was through Mazar. So we went there and were sort of documenting some things and working with some of the commandos there, and General Dostum had his forces there as well, and he was a sort of a big anti-Taliban warlord that the US worked with after 9/11. So we went there, and then within just a couple of days it had fallen, which was just it was so much quicker than what anyone could have anticipated. Certainly before I went, I talked to different intelligence people, I talked to people while I was there. Is Mazar going to hold? And everybody kept saying, yeah, it'll at least hold for a week or 2 weeks or however long. It's not going to fall. So we went there on a Thursday, very early Thursday morning, and at first things felt very normal, and I was very perplexed as to how all these provinces around the city were falling. And then, by the following day, it was started to become a little strange. You started to see a lot of people fleeing. People were becoming concerned. And then by Saturday, people were lining up outside the bank, and it was just this ghost city. And it was just so bizarre how quickly that happened. And I remember we'd gone out with the commandos the night before, and they, again, were insisting that it wasn't going to fall. And the earliest flight that I could get back to Kabul at that point was not until Monday evening. And so we're sort of thinking, well, I hope it holds, because at that point you couldn't do any road travel. And it's a long journey to Kabul. It's about 12 hours, but you certainly couldn't at that time, because the Taliban really controlled most of those roads. So we were just sort of hoping for the best. And then it was that Saturday, and I remember we couldn't find an interpreter because the interpreters had fled. Yeah. And finally we found somebody, and we ended up getting into this random cab, and we're driving sort of toward these front lines, and you just see all these people that were fleeing from outside the city and coming in, and there really wasn't any, and the cab driver just turned around and looked at me, and he said, "I'm scared." And I said, "Of course, we'll turn around." And I just, it was that feeling of, well, I don't know what's happening here, but there really isn't anywhere to go. And then by that evening, Jake and I had gone out to this kebab cafe that we always go to, and we just looked at each other, and there was nobody in the street. There was just nobody there. And this cafe normally is quite vibrant. The TVs are on playing soap operas. The TV was off, and there was just, it was so bizarre. And we just looked at each other and said, we need to go. Yeah. So we started to hurry back toward our hotel, and as we're hurrying back, I remember turning around and just seeing these motorcycles coming into the city, and that was the Taliban, and that was how quickly they were able to take it over. And we went to the roof, and I'm just sort of watching, and it was very confusing. And then all of a sudden, I got a notification that the flight had been cancelled. And then I was on the phone to an Afghan friend of mine living in London, and he's like, "Well, Mazar's fallen." And I said, "What do you mean it's fallen?" And then all of a sudden everybody's texting me, "Are you still in Mazar? Are you still in Mazar?" And it was certainly an uncomfortable feeling, because again, we didn't know at that point how they were going to respond to foreigners or to a journalist or to a woman. So yeah, it was certainly an unnerving feeling, but I think, as war reporters, we're taught, not to panic, to think very logistically about what it is you can do. And then Kabul fell the next day, which kind of put any opportunity of a rescue or anything like that certainly wasn't going to happen. So we're sort of stuck in this room trying to figure out how to approach it. And I think right from the beginning, I said, we just need to go and talk to the Taliban, which everybody was sort of alarmed at that idea, but I also knew enough and sort of had enough interaction with people that were close with the Taliban, or had been, friendly, or had family members even, in the Taliban, and that I felt confident enough that was going to be the right option, I think. And the people that were running the hotel were also very scared, because they previously worked for the government, and I didn't want to put them in any more jeopardy, and they were staying there to really protect us. And so we just sort of used an intermediary, and next thing you know, 2 Taliban elders came to the hotel to pick us up, and I'm getting in the Taliban's car, and he turns around and says, welcome to our country. And so it was very bizarre. And then the only really way out at that point, and a bunch of other younger Talibans came in, and we went to the Uzbek border and spent a couple of days there. And then Jake and I said, we're going back, which certainly was crazy at a time when everybody was fleeing.
Yeah.
We were very determined to stay, and everybody kept, freaking out, how are you going to get out? And I wasn't worried about that. I was concerned with telling the story, and I certainly planned to be there for several months. I didn't think just because the US left a place that we shouldn't be covering it adequately.
Right.
And so, I went back and sort of, I guess, the few journalists that really stayed there for a good chunk of time after the Taliban took over to really, I would hope, really document what was happening. And it certainly in many cases was very contrasted to what we were seeing in the news and the mainstream media. And I would look at these articles and I'd look at Twitter, and oftentimes it really perplexed me because I was like, this isn't a reflection of what is happening on the ground. And I'd click on the byline, and the person wasn't in Afghanistan. Yeah. So people were really relying on secondhand information or third-hand information. And there was just so much misinformation that was being perpetuated out there, photoshopped photos, things that were coming without any sort of fact-checking or credibility. It just baffled me, I think. And even in one case, somebody sent me, there was a church in Idaho somewhere who was, saying all these women were under threat, and had published a letter on their Instagram. And I went on their Instagram, I was like, this letter is fake. Like, the last thing that Afghans need now are missionaries raising money on fake information. Like, right. It just, but that was just, it was happening it was so widespread, and people were coming at me saying, how do I get so-and-so and so-and-so out? And I'm like, is there a genuine threat? Because to me, certainly there were cases, in many cases of retaliation, but it was very much the exception, not the norm.
Okay.
The Talibans were not, or are not, an insurgency. They are trying to be, however you want to paint it, a functioning government. But I guess, what was being perpetuated just wasn't a reflection of the ground. And I think if I hadn't been in Afghanistan, you'd think, oh my gosh, this must be genocide in the streets.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of people that were pushing that narrative and agenda, and it just wasn't true. It just wasn't accurate to what was happening.
Okay. Well, that's interesting because, like I said, here stateside, we get information that's already been filtered through several layers of mainstream media, and I sort of suspect that, what we hear is several times removed, from the things that you saw and experienced. That's interesting that you say these Taliban elders show up and pick you up, and they seem to be very polite and almost welcoming. Is that fair to say? Yeah,
it was just, honestly, it was incredibly bizarre. And so, of course, me, my journalist instinct kicks in. I said, well, can I interview you? And they say, sure. So I'm driving around Mazar with these Talibans, and I'm asking them about Islamic law. And they're telling me about, chopping a hand off when you steal. And, if you murder someone intentionally, then you will be hung. Or if you murder someone without intention, then you may have to pay a fine or a jail term. And then what was sort of the third thing they were stressing was, infidelity or was punished by stoning. So, they're telling me about their laws that they want to see put in place, and all with a big smile on their face.
and you're wondering, like, this is what people actually want to see in their country?
I think, it's I think for the most part, no. But, it's certainly, their interpretation of Sharia law is extremely draconian, and there are certainly a lot of Muslim majority countries who don't enforce it the way that they do. But mind you, the Taliban haven't enforced those particular laws yet. I think what they're doing is they're really waiting for that international recognition, and they know that if they start chopping hands off, that's not going to get them any, points with the international community. But what was really interesting is Afghanistan is an incredibly high crime place. The level of violent crime is really, it's it's really unfathomable. And it's very...
Is that outside of the Taliban?
Yeah, outside of Taliban, outside, even, under the previous government, the crime was just through the roof.
Okay.
And, it's kind of a unique place compared to, and I've worked in a lot of Muslim majority countries, Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Yemen, all over. And really, they're usually very incredibly honest places.
Mm-hmm.
I remember one time being in this terrible rented car in the middle of Amman in Jordan, and the boot in the back had accidentally been left open for hours. And I came back and there was a row of men sitting there and nobody touched a thing. That was all my belongings were in there, my laptop, everything, and my friends as well. And nobody even touched it. I just remember thinking, wow, that would just never happen in the US.
Anywhere.
But Afghanistan is a bit of an outlier because the level of crime there and the stealing and the theft and the violent crime. I mean, majority of people being admitted to a lot of the war hospitals were not being admitted necessarily by war injuries, but they were shot in a house invasion or in the street or in some sort of botched robbery. So the level of crime is really huge. And what you saw when the Taliban came that first month, it went dead. It was crazy. Like, I would go and talk to these shopkeepers and they were just like, there is no crime right now. And I think that was that was because people were so terrified of getting their hand chopped off.
Right. And
then I guess that was during September. And then by October, when people realized that wasn't going to be implemented, the crime went through the roof again and is soaring hugely. I had my own money stolen when I was there, and my fixer was held at gunpoint and had his phone and things stolen. But that's every day in Afghanistan. So,
but that's not any different than San Francisco.
No, it's not. Certainly not. Yeah. So it's but yeah, it was just sort of interesting to me that fear of the deterrent, was an incredibly huge fear.
Yeah.
That had been instilled in the normal, I guess, and there's a lot of criminal groups operating in Afghanistan.
So some of the things that I would hear, after the withdrawal of, U.S. troops is that, I'd see videos that, the caption of these videos was Taliban soldiers executing Afghanis who cooperated with the U.S. military. They're all lined up on their knees and Taliban soldiers were just shooting him in the back of the head.
I find that very hard to believe. I know that there are incidences of individuals that, had been, killed by the Taliban, but certainly there was no mass sort of killing of hundreds of Taliban soldiers. That just wasn't the case.
Okay.
And I think really what happened, there was so much fear. There is so much fear, and it becomes very contagious. So when somebody says, well, my neighbor is scared and my brother is scared and and so I need to leave. And I think what is being lost, and I get a lot of hate for saying this, but it's people need to leave. People are trying to leave because of the economic crisis that is in Afghanistan. It's an incredibly terrible, the economy is terrible. You cannot get money out of the bank. The inflation, the unemployment, the humanitarian crisis, there is no medicine. And this largely comes from, once the Taliban took power, the US immediately froze $9.5 billion in aid that was earmarked for Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm.
And the World Bank and the IMF also froze their aid. So the Taliban had no money or have no money. And so it's created this terrible, really terrible crisis where, the Afghan people are suffering again. And all day long, I just get desperate texts and messages from people just desperate to leave. And I think people will always use the guise of, I worked for the US military or I did something for a contracting group. But I do think for the most part, unless they were perhaps special forces and killed a lot of Talibans, the reality is that the Talibans, aren't going after those people. In fact, a lot of people have gone back to their government jobs, and the Talibans are urging people to go back even into the military and into the police force and to take back some of their jobs. So,
it's not as though as the Taliban are wantonly tracking down who they may have suspected cooperated with the U.S. military.
Right. And I think, people
burning
always,
them alive and things.
And people will argue and tell me, but this happened to my uncle or whatever it is. But really, for the most part, that it just isn't accurate. I think in the beginning, a lot of criminal groups also took advantage of the situation and were sort of posing to be these Talibans and going into homes. But I also know at the beginning, people would say, say, well, they're going around with a list, and so, my dad is on the list, or somebody I know is on the list. And when I sort of dug into it, what I found was that the Taliban were going around looking to claim back government property. So if you had a government issued weapon, or you had a government car, or you had some property that belonged to the government, they were confiscating that. And I know for a fact that the Taliban were going to houses, people, to collect these government weapons, but they would look at, if you had a gun that was your personal gun, they would give it back to you.
Okay.
So it wasn't as though they were sort of stealing personal property. Again, there are always exceptions to the rule. I always have to preface,
Sure.
I'm not talking about everybody, but really for the most part, that is a huge contingency of what was going on. And then that was sort of spawned in the media as to being, the Taliban have this hit list of people. And that wasn't, to my knowledge and to my understanding. And I really researched this very heavily. It just wasn't the case. And I met with a lot of people who are trying to leave the country and trying to get their visas out. And I can certainly understand the challenges with trying to stay in Afghanistan, especially if you have daughters, and the arbitrary nature of not being able to go to school. I think that's terrifying. But when I would sit and talk to these people and I'd say, well, what is your threat? And they would say, well, I have this letter, and I would look at it and it would be some sort of fake letter that's being passed around on WhatsApp that everybody has.
Yeah.
So I think there is there was a lack of due diligence in really trying to understand what the threat was and where it was coming from at the same time. But
do you feel like a lot of that misinformation, like the propagation of all of this, I want to maybe call it propaganda, but these, like I said, this video that's circulating, and then, the rumors that, the Taliban are just whipping random women in the streets and, finding like interpreters who cooperated with the U.S. government and, melting their credentials into their chest and then burning them alive. Do you feel like that stuff is used to sort of paint a worse picture of the current administration? And
yeah, I think there's a lot of different agendas at play. And when I really looked into a lot of the misinformation, and I found that a lot of it was being perpetuated by, supporters of resistance forces outside of Afghanistan and also India. And Afghanistan is very much a proxy place between fights between India and Pakistan.
Okay.
So it's what I also found is a lot of this stuff was emanating from accounts from those countries that were trying to, I guess, portray a different, each with a different agenda and how they wanted the world to see Afghanistan. So
Okay.
that's also a lot. And most of it was coming from outside the country. I think there was also a lot of that coming from people that had left or the diaspora. And, it's hard in these emotional situations, but it's sort of like, I know you're Afghan, but you're not here.
Mm-hmm.
You've left.
Yeah.
So where is this coming from? And it was just a lot of the times that, I remember there was one picture that was being circulated, and it was of a woman in a burqa, and she was walking, beside a man or behind a man, and there was a chain. She was like chained to him basically at her ankle. But that picture, when I looked into it, came from Baghdad in 2003, and the chain was photoshopped. So there was just so much of that. And, I think the Taliban need to certainly be held to account. They've committed a lot of atrocities over the years, but I think it's also important just to paint an accurate picture without an agenda.
Right.
And that's really what I tried to do. And I just, and even trying to do that, the amount of hate that I got from people. And it's sort of, I understand why, it's hard. It really disheartened me, because here I was on the ground trying to do diligence to a story just simply through accuracy without that agenda. And yet this sort of the hate and the, all sorts of name calling that came from that, it's frustrating. And there was moments there when I thought, why am I even bothering?
Yeah.
Why am I even trying to do real journalism if this is how it kind of gets spun? If it doesn't fit someone's narrative, they're going to come after me. And I thought, in the amount of excuses people come up with to go after you, and you're not Afghan, and you're working for the Taliban, and you're doing and I just thought, this is why people give up on journalism. This is why journalists give up on journalism, because you can only take so much of that when you're already in a high pressure situation, and it's incredibly frustrating.
Well, it's baffling to me how many people claim to be interested in the truth, but when they hear the truth and it doesn't reaffirm what, their preconceived notions or whatever biases they have, then, like you've experienced, you'll get that hate from them. You'll get that backlash because it clashes with what they already believe.
Yeah.
And instead of taking that information for what it is and trying to somehow incorporate that into their mentality and the way they draw conclusions and form opinions, they'll completely disregard it and dismiss you as, like you said, some sort of Taliban operative, pushing propaganda, when you're just trying to paint the accurate picture and get all of the information, and which is what I think people should value.
Yeah, but and many people do. It's always, the 100, nice comments you get, it's always overshadowed by the one horrible. But certainly, I found it to be just incredibly frustrating. And still now when I'm trying to sort of recap on the truth, if it's not what people want to hear, and that includes what the mainstream media doesn't want to hear.
Mm-hmm.
Mainstream media doesn't want to hear that a mass genocide isn't happening.
Yeah.
And it's this idea of the more clickbait something can become, the better it is. And it's infuriating to me in so many ways. And, I also think it's extremely hard for American population to separate the Taliban's from an insurgency to a government. Mm-hmm. And I said that many times to the Taliban's themselves. I said, you can't expect people to believe in your general amnesty or believe that you're trying to do the right thing when you've spent 20 years killing Afghans and Americans and NATO forces. You need to show by your actions that you are different. But I certainly think that anyone who tries to say that the Taliban's of 2021 are the same as the Taliban's of 1996. That is completely not right.
Okay.
There is certainly a very marked difference between, what was happening then, what was happening now. I don't know what's going to happen in 2 months or 2 years or however it is, but based on their quest to get international recognition and to somehow be seen as a legitimate government, at least for now, is keeping them on their best behavior. But yeah, we don't know what will happen. But certainly, and I talked to a lot of journalist friends of mine that lived in Afghanistan through the Soviet occupation of the 80s, the civil war of the 90s, the rise of the Taliban's, and they will all say the same thing as well. There really is no comparison between how they're implementing law now and how they did 20 years ago. It's a changed Taliban, I think.
Okay. So they're trying to be recognized as a legitimate governing body in Afghanistan. Is that?
Yes, they are. And that's going to be a struggle. I don't know that's going to happen anytime soon, but I think there is, the administration's going to have to face a very uncomfortable decision of deciding, well, do we want to just not recognize the Taliban's because of, their atrocious human rights record over the years, especially now, even with, women and girls not being able to go to public schools. And, there are many factors as to why they shouldn't be recognized. But at the same time, Afghan people are suffering. They're suffering hugely. And it's not the Taliban's who are going to be suffering from this humanitarian crisis. The Taliban's didn't get a salary for 20 years.
Yeah.
They even will tell me we're used to operating on a low overhead. They don't, they don't need all the bells and whistles that a lot of governments need, although they certainly want money to run a country. But the Afghan people are the ones who suffer. They've been through enough. And as uncomfortable as the concept might be to have some sort of dialogue and work with the Taliban's, I don't see a better alternative right now that will, if we turn a blind eye, that's not hurting the Taliban's, that's hurting Afghans.
Yeah.
And they've been through enough. And so, I don't want to see any more. You walk into a public hospital there and there are just babies dying left, right, and center. Yeah. The level of malnutrition is unfathomable. There is no medicine. If people are lucky enough, they'll try to get to Pakistan to get surgery for their baby, but most of the time people can't afford that. There are no sort of very few NGO presence on the ground there anymore, except for a few of the stable hospitals that have been there for a long time. And I don't want to see the Afghan people suffer anymore as a result of politics. And really that's what we're seeing happen at the moment. And it's heartbreaking.
This humanitarian crisis that you're describing, has that been pretty consistent over the years? Or
Yes. So Afghanistan's always had, it's always been one of the poorest countries on the earth. And in large part, I blame this US-backed government, firstly under the Karzai administration and then under Ghani, who, of course, fled the country, and allowed the Taliban to come into Kabul. But the level of corruption, Nate, was unfathomable.
Yeah.
And this went on for 20 years. And this was our tax dollars. And so when I speak to Afghanistans, I say, I take this personally because that was my money.
Mm-hmm.
And $2 trillion, Kabul could have been to buy, but it's not, because all that money never went to the Afghan people. It went into the pockets of corrupt people on every possible level, from right at the top to right at the bottom. Afghans could not get through daily life without paying a bribe. They couldn't get through a checkpoint. They couldn't get a passport. They couldn't do anything without having to pay somebody off. You had many, many cases, even in the legal system, of judges and lawyers and police people creating fake crimes just so that they could get bribe money, or from different like it just was on every level, and it was disgusting. And you had ghost soldiers, people that were never on the books. So what would happen if a soldier died in battle, the commander would take their bank card and still take their salary out every month, and that was the US taxpayer paying for that. And for whatever reason, the US knew this corruption was happening but refused to ever do anything about it. And reports would come out every year. There's a special inspector general, SAGAR reports. And John Sopko would come out with these reports every year about the corruption, about just how systemic it was. And yet there was never accountability. There was never any change. And to me, that was the number one reason the Taliban were able to come back to power, because not only did it create this weak system where, on paper, you might have 300,000 soldiers, but in reality, you really only have 100,000 because the rest don't exist.
Yeah.
But they're being, their salaries are being paid to somebody. But you also had the Taliban's being able to use that as a recruitment tool, saying, well, we're not going to be corrupt. We're going to take care of you. And so when if people didn't agree ideologically with the Taliban's, they were so fed up with the inept government and seeing their leaders rolling around with gold watches and Rolls Royces when they couldn't, get through daily life. Naturally, that's going to, people are going to want to fight against that,
right,
whether you agree with the religious ideology or not. So to me, that was really just the number one thing that brought the Taliban in. And yet, I say the US government knew about it and just thought it was, it was a secondary issue instead of being the core issue. And I just really hope, if we take anything away from the war in Afghanistan, we nip this, if we're ever going to enter a country or give any money to a foreign country, which we do a lot of, don't stand for corruption.
Yeah.
Stop it. I mean, you're never going to eliminate it. It happens everywhere. But the levels in Afghanistan shouldn't have been happening. And it really makes me angry because, as I said again, that was our money. And we basically paid for these people to be, to live these very affluent lives on the backs of Afghan people. And sadly enough, a lot of the times, these are now the same people that have safe haven in Western countries and that are claiming all these abuses against them. And it bothers me because they need to be held to account. These former government members, all these people who stole our money should be held to account. But I guarantee you nothing will happen.
That seems to be a recurring theme with the people in the upper echelons of any hierarchy, whether it's the Afghan government, the United States government. What is your criticism of the withdrawal of U.S. troops and the timing and just the way it took place?
I mean, it was an embarrassing mess, absolutely. And I think we can collectively say, whether we agreed with the war in Afghanistan or not, I think we can collectively agree that the way it ended was pretty heartbreaking. Really, Bagram Air Base should never have been closed prior to that happening, prior to the evacuation. I'm baffled as to why or how the US government really thought it was going to process people and get people out in that sort of small window of time.
Right.
That sort of blows my mind, how there was such little planning that came into it. And then really what else concerns me is that it sort of was this lucky dip as to whether you got on a plane or not. I know many people who qualify for SIVs and very much entitled to leave that are stuck in Afghanistan and can't get out. And I know a ton of people who did nothing to serve the United States or really didn't have a legitimate case for any sort of amnesty or persecution or asylum. And yet they're living happily in, these countries. And I think the whole purpose of it was for those people that were either incredibly vulnerable or who had supported the US. And yet I know people that were banned, that are banned from the US, that are now living in the US because they were fortunate enough to push their way onto an airplane. And whilst many people, who should be in those shoes just could never get to the gate in time. So it really bothers me the way that there was this sort of lack of coordination and lack of organization. And, I have concerns in the sense that I think so many Afghans want to leave, but many of them don't understand the challenges they're going to face as migrants. It's not going to be an easy life. You're not going to have throngs of family around you to support you and hand you a job and things like that. So I think there's going to be, just a lot of problems that stem from that. And I think already a lot of people I know that fled to Pakistan are trying to get back to Afghanistan. So I just think, on those levels, America should have really coordinated things a lot better and a lot differently and taken a lot more time in doing it. I'm not sure why there was this sort of fervent rush to be out by the end of August. And I think that, yeah, and it still blows my mind that the administration is trying to tout it as some kind of success, because it was far from any type of success.
So you've seen the video of that airplane taking off out of Afghanistan and the Afghan people clinging to the outside, the landing gear and things like that. Do you think that's due more to the desperation to get out of the country because of the economic crisis that they're facing? Or was it?
I think at that point, the economic crisis always existed at that point. It wasn't as exacerbated as it is right now, since the Taliban came in. But at that point, again, it was just this fear. And people's memories of the Taliban are the Taliban of the 1990s, where they were instituting these, terribly frightening laws, and they would have these morality police going around the street. And it was just sort of this terrifying time. And I think people's memories of that, they stay with you and you want to escape that. And at that point, we didn't really understand or know what approach the Taliban were going to take. So I think people's fear was just, was a very genuine fear. And it certainly was a desperate moment. And again, how that was able to sort of unfold, how people could even get themselves onto the wings of the airplane as it was taking off, that sort of just shows you, at least in that beginning phase, just how disheveled the whole thing was.
Yeah. That's so do you feel like, given, what you've described of sort of the nature of the Taliban now, right? Do you feel like the country, obviously it's incredibly unstable. You have this sort of this shift in power and, the previous government is no longer in power. The president fled the country. But given the level of corruption that you described having, previously existed, do you feel like there's a chance for there to be some sort of turnaround with that in Afghanistan?
I that's one thing I'd really like to see. And the Taliban's pledged that. But again, they don't have any money to be corrupt right now. We don't know what's going to happen when or if they get those large sums of money, if they will fall down that same path. Once again, it's hard to know. But certainly right now, what their sort of PR quest is that they aren't going to be corrupt. And I think they have a lot of some of the leaders, Dr. Abdullah, who was sort of the joint leader with Ghani, and also Karzai, the former president, are effectively under house arrest in Kabul at the moment. So I don't really know what their goal is with that, but I assume that, they're going to try to hold some certain high-ranking figures to account for corruption.
Okay. That's Yeah, that's interesting. It'll be interesting to see how that all unfolds in the future.
It really will be. And maybe they'll leave it alone. Maybe they'll be pressured by the United States to leave it alone and to not, to not go after some of these people that effectively the US backed. You know, sadly enough, the US backed for years extremely corrupt people.
Yeah.
And then wondered why the Taliban were able to come back to power so quickly.
I'm assuming that, I mean, you know, if the level of corruption in the Afghan government was so systemic that local law enforcement probably fell under that umbrella as well.
Absolutely,
I mean, they're probably not keeping the peace and law and order on the streets in Afghanistan anywhere.
Yeah, and that was also a challenge of, going through checkpoint and having to pay a bribe and do all these things. But at the same time, I also feel for the Afghan, especially the young soldiers and the police as well. I think they had a very, very difficult and challenging jobs, and so many of them have been killed over the years, to the point where they won't even release those statistics because of what that would have done to morale.
Yeah.
But certainly just tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, were killed over the past 20 years fighting. And really at the end of the day, they were sold out by those above them. So the Taliban were able to get back into power, not necessarily by bullets, but really just by having tea and a conversation with whoever was running that particular district, and was like, well, we'll give you amnesty and you can go to wherever, or we'll, give you a small amount of money or whatever that bribe may be, for them to just basically hand over the city or the district to the Taliban. And really that's how it happened. And so you had a lot of these really young soldiers that were just sold out. And that was heartbreaking for me, because, there was no sort of escape for them. And many of them had sacrificed so much. So I was very saddened when, immediately after that takeover, when President Biden went on TV and was saying, these people ran away. And yes, they did run away, but they didn't, it was sort of a situation where your leadership had sold you out. Who were you fighting for anymore? The people that you were supposed to fight for had thrown you completely under the bus, had in many cases left the country themselves to go to these, safe house mansions in Uzbekistan or the UAE or wherever it may be. And you, as the foot soldier, were just left to the slaughter, and nobody cared about you. Of course you're going to run away. Why would you keep fighting when you know that you've already lost? Somebody's already handed, that defeat and didn't bother to tell you. So naturally, when you get that message, you're going to run, because there isn't many other choices. So I think, that really broke my heart when the blame was kind of put on them.
That seems to be another recurring theme. I don't doubt that would be the case in the United States if something similar were to happen, because we don't see it on a level as has been seen in Afghanistan. But, I write about in my book that from the top down, you have administrators and supervisors who are very well insulated, from the harm that can be done as far as, public opinion. And they're always willing to make the rank and file guys their scapegoats, or their patsy, or however you want to describe them. And like you say, throw them under the bus to appease an angry mob, or, an angry group of people for political reasons, or whatever the case is. But that, it's definitely not exclusive to Afghanistan or to the United States. That's for sure.
Absolutely.
So you covered the George Floyd incident last year when that took place, and were you actually present there in Minneapolis when?
I went to Minneapolis. I think that was more toward the end of the summer.
Okay.
So that was sort of not right in the beginning, but I went a couple of months after that, and just sort of to talk to people from different sides, really, and try to get a little bit more of a deeper understanding of the dynamics there and what was happening. But I had also spent a little bit of time, I guess would have been 18 months prior. I spent a bit of time with that particular police unit, covering a terrorism issue in Minneapolis. So I was sort of familiar with a lot of people there, and also the, police units there, and had sort of covered things that were different to that case, obviously, but I had some background working in Minneapolis.
Were the riots and those types of things? Was that still going on while you were there?
It was still going on to a degree, but not as bad, right? There was sort of, I guess, the memorial area where it was a bit of a no-go zone.
Mm-hmm.
So really, when I talked to some of my police contacts working there, they said, we don't go there. So if somebody goes in there and you're shot, basically then, someone has to bring you outside that area for you to be able to get any medical care or medical help. So they were very much, we don't go there. We're not allowed to go there. That is sort of and police no-go zone was sort of those blocks that were a memorial for George Floyd.
Was that a policy that had been created by the mayor or the city council?
I don't know how formal the policy was, but that was basically the direction. Or, if a lot of the police too were just, we're not going. I certainly don't think, as much as they wanted to do their job, I certainly don't think any of them were particularly wanting to go into that area.
Yeah.
But there was a lot of violence that was still happening in that area. So especially in the evening. So again, if you got shot, you had to go outside that zone.
That's crazy to think about, that there are, areas in the United States like that exist, where you can't get that direct help that you need, whether it's from police or EMS or, probably even the fire department wouldn't be able to go in, without some sort of obstacle.
And it, my understanding was that it was quite a fire hazard as well, being in police, fire trucks not being able to kind of adequately enter, and a lot of those entrances and things blocked off. And I think that had become a bit of a concern to a lot of the citizens in the area.
Were you able to talk to any of the people that participated in the protests, or any of the rioters or anything like that?
Yeah, I've talked to a lot of those people in different cities, including the ones there. I think generally, it's a fairly sort of standard, what we've all heard, kind of response in people feel that, policing has to change, and that there needs to be, a lot of the sort of, you certainly have the groups that are very pro defund, but I think in the core of it, a lot of people didn't necessarily want to see a complete defund, but wanted to see funds allocated into different places, and wanted to see, I guess, an overall change in
sort of reform.
Yeah. But I do know from my experience in doing several sort of embeds and ride-alongs with that same police unit in, I guess it was 18 months prior, and what I did see was, there was sort of a lot of gang activity, and many times somebody would get shot, and we'd go to the hospital, and the person shot didn't want to say who, shot them, because it's a gang related thing, and you don't want to be the snitch.
Right.
So, you could see the police were like, well, there's not really anything we can do if they're not going to interview or talk about what happened.
Yeah.
What are we supposed to do? So, there's certainly challenges that come from that as well.
Yeah. That would be an incredibly difficult job. I mean, I've always said this, I've never worked in a urban area like Minneapolis or Houston or, any of those other high crime areas, but I can certainly imagine the challenges that they face. I mean, to an extent, we don't have a huge gang problem here in Idaho, and especially not in Twin Falls, not like the way they do in those cities. But I've had my experience with people who, refuse to cooperate with an investigation because they're more fearful of retaliation than they are of just sort of taking their chances at, being able to protect and defend themselves without the help of the police department doing their investigation. So, I guess, what do you feel like is the proper response to all of it? So to the demand for reform or defunding, or, whatever you want to label it, reallocating resources as far as, police work and law enforcement is concerned. Do you think there's a legitimate need for that, or how do you view that?
I'm someone who, is very much, I work in a lot of countries where there really isn't any law and order, and I certainly don't think that's a very desirable thing to have in the United States. I think we take for granted, something like the ability to call 911, which most places, most countries that I work in, that you can't do that. Yeah. Somebody breaks into your house, somebody rapes your child, somebody does something atrocious, and you don't really have any recourse to respond to that. And so I certainly think, that's the last thing that I would want to see in the US. But, at the same time, I think it's really important to listen to voices, to listen to concerns that people have, and I think it's something that's sort of instilled in us young is maybe an inherent fear that we have of police. And that is maybe, I don't know anyone who's driving along a highway who doesn't get scared a little bit when you see that highway patrol. You're like,
right.
Oh my God, am I speeding? What am I doing? Is my tail light out? And I think it would be nice to somehow heal that response, so that immediate knee-jerk reaction isn't, oh my God, what am I doing wrong, and who's going to come after me, and who's going to find me, and I think it would be nice if we ever got to this point where we could see a police car and just be like, oh, hi, cool, without having that immediate fear. And I think that takes work from both sides, really. I think that takes work from being able to maybe change some of the interactions that people have, and also seeing a lot more of the good side that the police do, in being able to protect vulnerable neighborhoods, and being able to to serve. And I certainly am very aware that the police do a lot of that, but we don't see a lot of that. I think generally our interactions with the police are skewed very negative. And I would like to see that that change. And I don't necessarily know how you sort of change that, but I think being able to have more positive interactions with local law enforcement on for the most part would benefit everyone, whether that's in a small town or in a large city. I think that's sort of something that we need to I guess see a little bit more of.
I think, and I definitely agree. I think it's something we do need to see a lot more of. I just don't know. I don't know how we would accomplish that, because, like you brought up before, mainstream media, they're not interested in in those positive interactions. They're more interested in the negative ones, the ones that will spark controversy and
get a lot of clicks.
Yes.
A lot of clickbait. Yeah.
Yeah. Just like with the situation in Afghanistan, they're not interested in the story that, that you've been telling, as far as, the Taliban not being just sort of like this mindless rabble of killers and thugs who are beating women in the street. And, they're more interested in becoming a legitimate government in Afghanistan. But the mainstream media doesn't want to report on that. And on either side, I think. I think you have, people who want the Biden administration to look even worse than it already looks. But when it comes to police work, I think, I can't count the number of positive interactions I had with members of the public just here in Twin Falls, Idaho, as well as, those of my coworkers. So if you take the number of positive interactions you have all over the United States with members of the public and the police department, it would far outnumber the number of negative interactions. But, I was watching NFL football last night, and there was a commercial that came on that was sponsored by the NFL about, it was some sort of, social justice initiative for the Black community. And one of the taglines in this, in this commercial was that Black people are over policed. And I'm thinking about that particular statement, and perhaps that's true, but not for the reasons that people think that it is. I think what they want people to believe is that, police officers are prejudiced and they're discriminatory and they police Black people just because they're Black. But I think what I've seen in the research that I've done on this is that, a lot of the Black community live in these lower socioeconomic neighborhoods that are very high in crime, and police officers are paid to go where the crime is. So it's not as though police officers are, at least in my experience and what I've seen and researched on, police officers aren't targeting Black communities because they're Black. It's just that a lot of those communities are higher in crime than as compared with some other communities. So I think and I know that there's a lot of positive interactions between police officers and members of the Black community, because I've seen them, whether with my own eyes or through some video that's circulating the internet. But those things won't show up on CNN or those types of social media or news media outlets. But what are some things that you think people can do to be better informed about the issues, whether facing our country, facing, whether it's your specific state you live in or community, what are some of the things, some strategies or tactics or however you want to label that? What can people do to be better informed?
Yeah, I see a lot, people speak a lot now of, I don't watch the news. And I'm better because, my stress is better because I don't watch the news, or I ignore it. And I kind of look at them and I go, well, how are you staying informed? Like,
right.
Great that your stress is better, but I think we all have certain obligations just as sort of citizens of a country, of the world, to understand what's happening at least a little bit. Sadly, we are in a time where the news is so polarized and there is an agenda. And I think most of us are very aware of the agenda. I think most of us are very aware that, if we're going to turn on MSNBC, it's going to be, much more of a leftist agenda, as opposed to if we're going to turn on Fox News, it's going to have a lot more of a right wing sort of audience. And I think that doesn't mean we don't watch them. I think it means that we just have to be aware that that's where it's coming from, and that doesn't make it wrong. It just makes it, that's driven by that side. So I think the only thing you can really do is researching. If you're looking at one topic, don't just rely on one news article to inform you about that topic. You're going to have to sort of read a few from news outlets and kind of get the best picture that you can to make up your mind as best as possible. And I think that I think we're so often we are trying to, if we belong to one political party, we feel that we have to just follow that narrative hook, line, and sinker and do, believe it or everything that particular party espouses. Yeah. And I think we've lost this ability to be able to go issue by issue and have an informed opinion or a formed belief of how we see that issue that doesn't necessarily toe a party line. And I think that's something that's missing, that I wish that we could get back to, was to sort of leave. Not everything has to be about politics, and to be able to look at an issue and configure it without wondering, is this going to fit the narrative of whatever political party I'm registered to wants me to believe.
Yeah.
So really just, you have to put the time in.
Yeah, definitely. Well, that's what I try to do, is as much as I don't, and I think this about me, is that I lean much more to the right. But I like to consider myself just right of center. I don't consider myself to be, to the far right. And I get my news and my information from many different outlets, and I'll watch CNN and I'll read, an article from the Washington Post or the New York Times or, whatever the case is. And I'll take in that information from several different sources. So, but like you said, I think you have to. And like you said, it's not that you're necessarily subscribing to those political perspectives, but gathering as much information as you can possibly can to make the most well-informed decision that you can make. Yeah.
And it's a shame that journalism has become so sort of partisan like that. I think, when I was starting journalism and, even though I started my career at Fox, one thing that was really drilled into me back then, which sadly I don't think exists as much there now, but back then, you had to be balanced. There was no way an editor was going to publish a story of mine unless I got both sides or three sides or four sides or however many sides needed to be. There was a huge emphasis on balanced reporting. And a huge emphasis on, you were never allowed to have a question in a headline or anything that was too clickbaitish. And I really appreciated that. And I think that's sort of where I was able to, a lot of these journalistic values, I was able to really kind of take on and look at things with a very objective eye and take in, especially when you are working in complex conflict zones. And so I was really grateful for that sort of training. Sadly, I don't think that is pushed really anymore. I don't think there is an emphasis on getting multiple sides in a story. I think it's really just what one side wants to hear. And when we live in these echo chambers, you're missing out. And it doesn't necessarily, you can read a Washington Post article about a topic and just roll your eyes and think, oh my goodness, like this is crazy. But you can still take something away from that, and you can still at least have an understanding of where the other side sits. And I still, I use that same approach, even with, say, for Afghanistan, so much of my job every day was interacting with the Taliban, going to their office. They were my next door neighbors, just everywhere you went, there were the Taliban. And you'd sit and you'd talk to them, and some of them were responsible for shooting down American aircraft and, were linked to the Haqqani network that had, kidnapped however many people. I even interviewed ISIS fighters. And the way that I sort of take away from that is it's not my job to give them a platform or a voice or any of these buzzwords. It's to be a communication with the other. And I think so often we want to paint pictures as being black or white, as right or wrong, as red or left. And we don't understand how the other thinks. And so for me, I felt that it's very important to highlight or to get inside that psyche of the Taliban, or, whether it's ISIS or whatever country I'm working in, because that's how we learn. That's how we grow. That's how we hopefully avoid mistakes of the past. And so I think you can sort of apply that same thing to looking at the news now, reading something that you may not necessarily agree with, but you need to understand how and where the quote unquote other sort of formulates their argument, or put yourself in their shoes and be able to be a bit more of a voice of reason. Yeah.
One of the more dangerous trends or patterns that I see happening in our country is censorship of speech, of ideas, of.
Yeah, that's a big concern.
Yeah. I mean, because, just like we've been talking about, I mean, I would like to have all of the information that's available on whatever issue, whatever topic we're discussing, or, that is relevant at the time. I want to have all sides of it. But I think we're seeing this push to censor our opponents or censor the other side so that they don't have, so that we can't see the other side. We're automatically supposed to just agree with one side or the other. And if we not necessarily disagree, but even if we want to question and explore another version or another side of that, then, we're labeled by the other side as.
It is concerning. And we really have social media, I think, is driving that hugely. So you have these Silicon Valley big tech companies that are suddenly making decisions about what you can and can't learn. And it's incredibly infuriating. Even when I was in Afghanistan, both my photographer and I, here we are, in this precarious positions and, sacrificing a lot of our own stuff to try to tell these stories. And so many times my photographs would be taken down off Instagram, or, he experienced the same thing. And I just thought, and really what it came down to was that you couldn't use the word Taliban. And it's like, Taliban means student in Pashto, first of all. Okay. And second of all, it's a legitimate news topic. Yeah. And it was legitimate. This is at one point, the number one news issue in the world in August, September. So, and yet any post that you put with the word Taliban in it was immediately taken down. Yeah. And I thought, how do people learn the real situation if you can't even use a word that means student in Pashto? Right. And who is making this decision? And it was infuriating because here we were trying to educate people on the situation and what was happening. And, if I happen to forget and use the full word without, breaking it up with some weird star or something, the post would just get taken down without any sort of recourse to that. And it drove me crazy.
Well, that's the question I'd like answered is who in the corporate ladder, in this hierarchy of these big tech companies, is the one deciding what we can see and hear on social media, right? Yeah. Who are they to decide what's right and what's wrong and what information is appropriate for us to see and hear and what's inappropriate? Because I don't think there should ever be anybody dictating that.
Yeah. And obviously, there shouldn't be people dictating that. And we're in a very, arbitrary position. Obviously, if something's going to spark incredible violence or something, then, maybe it needs to be looked at. But most of the time it's not. It's people and opinion, and we're not children, we are adults who can make up our own mind. And I think the loss of free speech is an incredibly dangerous slippery slope that we're seeing. And then you sort of have all these excuses. Well, free speech or First Amendment, that has consequences. Well, okay, but this is sort of like this blanket argument that's being used for everything without actually addressing that that free speech really doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
It just doesn't.
Is that one of the biggest issues you see we're facing today? Because I was going to ask you that as well. You know, what do you think is one of the biggest issues that, at least I guess in the United States, that we're faced with?
Yeah, I do think the lack of free speech is a huge issue. I think that certainly we have a huge amount of problems in the US, but we also forget that we also have it a lot better than most of the countries that I visit.
Yeah.
And what people would do in Afghanistan to come to the United States, what they would give up, that is the dream.
Yeah.
And that's not to take away that, the many problems we have, and we have huge problems in poverty and many things, but I see it as it's hard for me sometimes to come back and relate to a lot of it, especially when I've spent, months in a war zone of watching, babies die of malnutrition and people just really in the worst circumstances. And then I sort of come back and bombarded with all this, PC stuff or something. And it's often very hard for me to kind of wrap my head around it or to kind of understand where it's coming from, because I think we've lost perspective a lot.
Absolutely. When you hear, I hear it all the time. I hear about how the United States is such an awful place, but I think most of that comes from a lot of younger people who don't really have a lot of life experience and don't really know what life is like outside of the United States. And so they just kind of assume that, because there are some minor hardships in their lives, that life must be better in other countries. Yeah. Do you feel like that's a pretty ridiculous mentality to have?
I feel like that's what's being fed to people, and that's just what they're growing up to believe. And yeah, I'd suggest if you want to go live in Syria, go ahead. If you think it's going to be better, go ahead.
Yeah.
Because you'll quickly learn it's not.
Yeah.
And again, that doesn't mean that we don't work to fix problems. And, I certainly support people's right for peaceful protest and people's right to argue on any side of a political debate. But I think that just overall, the doom and gloom is bizarre to me.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think we've just lost. You can't be patriotic anymore, because that will also paint you with one particular brush as well. Mm-hmm. So it's a strange time to be in.
Yeah. People label you a nationalist if you are proud of being an American, or at least grateful for living in America that's as prosperous as the United States.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and it's a shame we've come to that point. Yeah. As I said, what people would do to live in the US, I think is, it should just be a reminder for all of us how lucky we are with all its problems.
Yeah.
We can go to bed at night, generally speaking, and know that a bomb is not going to be dropped on our house.
Right.
And I think that in itself is an incredible gift to have in this day and age. For
sure. Yeah, I think that's a perspective that people just, not to say that it's lost on a lot of people. I just don't think they've ever had that. Mm-hmm. They've never had to think about that dark side of life that people in other countries have to live with. So, so we know that you're constantly busy running around all over the world covering these news stories. What do you do for fun, Hollie?
Oh my gosh. Somebody asked me that question today and said, what's fun to you anymore? And I said, oh God, I don't know. Cause I'm so busy working. My work is fun to me. It's as much as hard it is. Mm-hmm. There are many fun times, and I'm so grateful to have that. I think so many people spend their lives wondering, what it is that's their purpose or their passion. And so I'm very grateful to have learned what that was at a young age and to pursue it. And I really can't imagine doing anything else. But in terms of fun, I do have a motorcycle, which is currently in storage in New York. So I have to figure that part out. But that's a little challenging during the winter. Yeah. I love to surf.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I don't mind going to the range, every now and then. I quite enjoy that when I come to the US. So yeah, that's sort of my fun. And then
thank goodness for that Second Amendment, right?
I know. Thank goodness for that Second Amendment. I think again, people don't realize the importance of a Second Amendment, in situations where your government won't back you, and you can look at Afghanistan again. And you know, how are you able to defend yourself and your family when your own government, previous government, didn't have its back? The Taliban's is, you know, a little bit inept when it comes to investigating any sort of crime. And then the crime rate's so high. So what are you left with?
Yeah.
And what are you going to do when those criminal groups come to your door and you don't have something like a Second Amendment right and that legal path to own a gun? So
Yeah.
I think that is something that is incredibly important. So yeah, and then horse riding. So I think my next home, which I need to figure out a home because I've been living out of a backpack for a really long time, will be a lot more centered on in the horse and hunt world than it will be on the high rises that I've been living in for a while.
Yeah. Well, that'll be good. Hopefully that'll be nice and peaceful for you. Will you be able to handle all that peace and quiet? And
you know, I will, because that's great for writing. But I think too, especially when you do this work and being a writer and again, it's a war reporter, it is a very lonely profession. I think we forget that. We don't, you know, I don't go in with crews or security, or I don't have a team. I'm not a television crew. You know, obviously not military where you have, you know, a lot of other, you know, fellow soldiers. So you're really going in at it alone. And I think that's sort of sometimes the hardest thing when you come back is to force yourself to integrate with other people, because it can be very easy to slip into your own head and to be very comfortable there and not want to interact and not want to have these silly conversations about, you know, silly things that are permeating, you know, and it's hard. It takes an adjustment, and I think you have to make an effort. So there's pros and cons, but I just have to force myself to be a little bit more social.
Well, that's good. Well, I was glad to see you at the Christmas party the other day. Well, I think the work that you do is incredibly important, and I think there needs to be a lot more of that type of investigative journalism and, you know, boots on the ground, people seeing with their own eyes and being able to report back to the people who actually want to hear the truth and know what the facts are, and without it, like I said, without it being filtered through so many levels of mainstream media, so that you only hear and see what they want you to hear and see. So I think it's wonderful what you're doing.
Thank you. I appreciate the support.
Yeah, absolutely. Where can people find your so you've got one book that's out already, another one in the works, obviously D'Angelo Publications, right?
Yes. So that's available for pre-order, I think, on their website. So it'll be a photo book. It will be, and I'll probably do an audio version too, but it will be, you know, a lovely coffee table book. So my photographer, who's really incredible, Jake, he has some great photos, and then I've done the writing to accompany that, so it'll be an easy read, but sort of something special and telling the story in a very visual way. So,
nice. Yeah. And what's the title again?
It'll just be Afghanistan. And I think the subtitle is The Rise and Fall of the Taliban.
Wow. Yeah. That'll be great as far as like the visual, you know, that people will be able to get from that. I'll leave a link in the description section on the podcast and on the YouTube video so that people can go in and pre-order a copy.
Yes. So. And get Only Cry for the Living while you're at it.
Yes. Yeah. Only Cry for the Living. So yeah, D'Angelo Publications. I've been posting their website all over the place, obviously, because of my own book.
Yeah.
But you'll be able to get Hollie's, 2 of her books, through that website as well. So, well, Hollie, thanks again for joining me. This was incredibly informative and eye-opening, and I'm glad we could do this.
Absolutely. Anytime. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no problem.